the old Boston Garden was never quiet. The wooden floor creaked under the weight of history, the crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising like a storm. And at the center of it all stood Larry Bird, stoic, unflinching, the sharp-eyed son of French Lick, Indiana. He was not just another scorer. He carried himself like a man who remembered every insult, every elbow, every smirk from an opponent who dared to test him. For Bird, basketball was never only about points on the scoreboard. It was about pride, about proving himself against those who thought they could break him. And once you crossed that line, once you left a scar on his memory, it was nearly impossible to be forgiven. His rivalries became legends, burned into the culture of the NBA. They were not friendly duels, they were battles etched in sweat, pain, and glory. The 1980s belonged to Bird as much as anyone. 3 championships, 3 straight Most Valuable Player awards, and endless nights when he seemed untouchable. Yet woven into those triumphs were moments of tension so strong that even decades later, fans recall them with a shiver. A skyhook floating over his outstretched arms. A stolen ball that shifted the fate of a series. A shootout that turned into a test of willpower. And a fight that left both men humbled, forever tied together by a single night of chaos. These stories are not about random games. They are about names, 5 names that Bird could never quite erase from his mind. They pushed him, provoked him, and in some cases, left him with grudges that lasted long after the buzzer. To understand Larry Bird is to understand that his greatness was sharpened by these clashes. He never forgot, and he never let go. Tonight, we return to those rivalries. To the moments that defined an era, to the players who stood in his way, and to the wounds that never truly healed. This is the story of the 5 rivals Larry Bird could never forgive. The story of Larry Bird cannot be told without the shadow of Magic Johnson. Their rivalry defined the 1980s, stretching from college hardwoods to the grandest stage in the NBA. It was not just a battle of teams, it was a clash of styles, cities, and personalities. Bird carried the grit of Boston on his shoulders, Magic embodied the glitz of Los Angeles. And every time they met, the league seemed to pause, waiting for the sparks to fly. It began in 1979, long before the banners of the 80s were hung. Magic's Michigan State faced Bird's Indiana State in the NCAA championship, and the world got its first glimpse of the duel that would carry into the professional game. Magic triumphed that night, and Bird never forgot the sting. When they both entered the NBA the following season, it was clear that destiny had set them on a collision course. By 1984, the rivalry reached its peak. The Celtics and Lakers clashed in the finals, and Bird delivered the championship that cemented his place among the legends. But Magic answered swiftly the next year, leading the Lakers to victory over Boston in 1985. Each triumph and defeat was personal. For Bird, every smile from Magic after a win cut deeper than a headline. Every assist that turned into a dagger against Boston was remembered. Then came 1987, and the moment that would haunt Bird forever. Game 4 of the finals, with the series hanging in the balance, Magic drove into the paint and lofted a delicate hook shot over Bird's outstretched arms. The ball dropped through the net, silencing the Garden crowd and shifting the momentum of the series. The Lakers would go on to claim the title, leaving Bird with a memory he could never shake. He admitted later that it was one of the most painful defeats of his career. Yet what made their rivalry unique was the layer of respect beneath the fire. Bird recognized Magic's brilliance, even as he felt the sting of those losses. And Magic, in turn, often credited Bird with pushing him to greater heights. They were opposites who needed each other, competitors who defined each other. Still, for Larry Bird, the wounds lingered. The missed chances, the titles lost to the Lakers, and that skyhook that seemed to hang in the air forever, those moments etched themselves into his memory. Magic Johnson was not just an opponent. He was the rival who stood across from him on the biggest stage, again and again, forcing Bird to confront both glory and heartbreak. And that is why, when you ask about the players Larry Bird could never quite forgive, Magic Johnson's name will always be near the top of the list. If Magic Johnson was the rival who stood across the finals stage, Isaiah Thomas was the one who waited in the trenches of the Eastern Conference. His Pistons were not glamorous, not built on flash or Hollywood charm. They were scrappy, relentless, and unapologetic. And at the heart of it all was Isaiah, a smiling assassin whose calm demeanor masked a ruthless competitive fire. For Larry Bird, there was no forgetting the battles with Detroit and no forgiving the man who orchestrated them. Their rivalry crystallized in the spring of 1987. The Celtics and Pistons met in the Eastern Conference Finals, a series that would stretch both teams to the breaking point. Late in Game 5, with seconds remaining, Detroit clung to a 1-point lead. The Garden was tense, the season on the line. Isaiah, inbounding from the sideline, looked for a safe pass. In that instant, Bird pounced. He darted across the lane, snatched the ball from the air, and whipped it to Dennis Johnson streaking to the hoop. Johnson scored, the Celtics won, and the building shook as if it might crumble. That steal became one of the most iconic plays of Bird's career, but for Isaiah, it was a scar. And for Bird, it was proof that even the smallest mistake could tilt destiny. But fate has a way of evening the scales. The following year, in 1988, the Pistons returned sharper, meaner, and determined. They pushed the Celtics aside and claimed the East for themselves, denying Bird another chance at the finals. The balance of power had shifted. Bird, battling injuries and exhaustion, watched as Isaiah's team became the league's new villains, celebrated and despised in equal measure. Every hit, every hard foul, seemed to carry Isaiah's signature as the floor general of the Bad Boys. What made the rivalry especially bitter was the contrast in their styles. Bird was blunt, straightforward, a player who let his game and his sharp tongue speak loudly. Isaiah, on the other hand, wore a smile that never faded, even when he was orchestrating a dagger against Boston. To Bird, that combination of charm and cruelty was hard to swallow. It wasn't just physical battles, it was mental warfare. Years later, Bird could still feel the tension when speaking of those Pistons years. Respect? Certainly. Isaiah was brilliant, a Hall of Fame guard who led his team to back-to-back championships. But forgiveness? That was harder. The memories of those Eastern Conference wars, the bruises and heartbreak, did not fade so easily. For Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas was more than a rival, he was the mastermind of the very team that wrestled control of the East away from Boston. And that made him one of the opponents Bird could never quite forgive. If Isaiah Thomas was the brains of the Pistons' rise, Bill Laimbeer was the enforcer. He stood at 6'11" with a scowl that seemed permanent, a player who embraced contact and never apologized for it. For Larry Bird, Laimbeer represented everything that made those Detroit teams infuriating: physical play that bordered on reckless, constant confrontations, and a refusal to back down. It was a rivalry that cut beyond basketball, it felt personal. In the late 1980s, the Celtics and Pistons collided year after year, with each series more brutal than the last. The Pistons' identity was forged in their toughness, and Laimbeer was the face of that identity. Against Boston, he made it his mission to rough up anyone wearing green, and Bird, Boston's leader, was the prime target. Screens were set with extra force, rebounds were ripped down with elbows flying, and every possession felt like a brawl disguised as a basketball game. Bird, never one to shy away from a fight, gave as good as he got. He was fiery, quick to bark back, and unwilling to let Laimbeer intimidate him. Yet the clashes often spiraled into moments that left scars. Fans still recall the heated exchanges, the shoves, the glares, and the times referees had to step in before things went further. To Bird, Laimbeer was not simply another opponent, he was an irritant who seemed determined to test his patience and pride. One of the defining battles came during the Eastern Conference Finals of 1987 and 1988. The Pistons' rise meant Boston had to go through Laimbeer's bruising presence in the paint, and every rebound felt like a war. Boston's veterans were battered, Bird included, and while the Celtics managed to hold on in 87, Detroit finally broke through in 88. For Bird, it was more than losing a series. It was watching Laimbeer celebrate, knowing that physicality had toppled finesse. What made it worse was Laimbeer's attitude. He rarely admitted fault, often brushing off criticism with a smirk. To Celtics fans, he became a villain, booed every time he stepped onto the Garden floor. To Bird, he was a symbol of frustration, the kind of rival who did not inspire respect in the same way Magic or Isaiah did. With them, the battles were fierce but dignified. With Laimbeer, it felt like crossing a line. Even years later, when reflecting on his career, Bird could recall the bitterness of those encounters. He carried grudges, and Lame Beer's name was one that always surfaced. Not because Lame Beer was the most talented opponent, but because he embodied the bruises, the battles, and the bitterness of an era when basketball in the East was as much about survival as it was about skill. For Larry Bird, Bill Lame Beer was not just a rival. He was the thorn in Boston's side, the face of Detroit's physical onslaught, and a reminder that some grudges never fade. There are rivalries built on animosity, and then there are rivalries forged in fire and respect. Larry Bird's clashes with Dominique Wilkins belonged to the second kind of duel between two warriors who brought out the very best in each other. For Bird, Dominique was not an enemy to despise, but a rival whose brilliance forced him to dig deeper than ever before. And though the respect was mutual, the memories of those nights still lingered, etched into Bird's long memory of battles he could never quite forget. The defining chapter came in the spring of 1988. The Celtics, aging and battered, faced a rising Atlanta Hawks squad led by Dominique, known to fans as the human highlight film. His vertical leaps, thunderous dunks, and sheer scoring power turned every game into a spectacle. But against Boston, his artistry met Bird's grit, and together they produced one of the greatest duels in playoff history. Game 7 of the Eastern Conference semifinals at the Boston Garden remains the centerpiece of their rivalry. The Hawks and Celtics traded blows for 6 games, and now everything rested on 48 minutes. From the opening tip, Dominique attacked relentlessly, scoring from all angles, soaring through defenders, and silencing the crowd with each basket. By the fourth quarter, he had poured in points with machine-like precision, climbing toward the mid-40s on the stat sheet. Bird, however, was not about to let his season end quietly. As the tension built, he delivered one of the most remarkable fourth quarters of his career. Step-back jumpers, drives through traffic, clutch free throws. Every possession was a counterpunch to Wilkins' brilliance. Bird scored 20 points in that final frame, answering shot for shot, possession for possession. The Garden crowd roared with each basket, sensing they were witnessing something historic. When the buzzer finally sounded, Boston had escaped with a narrow 118-116 victory. Dominique finished with 47 points, Bird with 34, but the numbers only told part of the story. It was not about who outscored whom, it was about two men locked in a test of wills, pushing each other to heights neither could have reached alone. Bird admitted later that he had never been challenged so completely in a single game. Dominique's performance stayed with him, not as a wound of humiliation, but as a reminder of how fragile victory could be. For Bird, Dominique Wilkins was a rival he could never dismiss. Their duel was not built on bitterness, but on the sharp edge of competition. Yet the memory of that night when everything hung in the balance, when his legacy itself felt on trial, was something Bird could never erase. Respect and rivalry coexisted, and for Larry Bird, Dominique was proof that sometimes the opponents you admire most are also the ones who leave scars you never forget. Long before the Pistons rose to power, before the duels with Dominique, Larry Bird's fiercest tests came against Julius Erving and the Philadelphia 76ers. In the early 1980s, no rivalry captured the NBA's intensity quite like Celtics versus Sixers. It was a battle for control of the Eastern Conference, and at the heart of it stood Bird and Dr. J, two icons from different worlds, colliding on the same stage. Dr. J was basketball elegance personified. His soaring dunks, smooth stride, and quiet charisma made him a hero well beyond Philadelphia. Bird, on the other hand, was blunt, sharp-edged, and fearless. Their games could not have been more different, yet whenever Boston and Philly clashed, their paths were destined to cross. For years, the two traded blows in the playoffs, splitting series that often went the full 7 games. Each encounter was filled with drama, each victory a wound for the other side. But one night in November 1984 transformed their rivalry from fierce competition into something unforgettable. On that evening in Boston Garden, frustrations boiled over. Bird, lighting up the scoreboard with his shooting, taunted his defender. Dr. J, growing irritated, finally snapped. What followed was one of the most notorious altercations in NBA history. The two legends squared off, hands grabbed, tempers flared, and the referees had no choice but to eject them both. The league levied fines afterward, but the damage was already done, an enduring image of Bird and Erving, locked in confrontation, forever etched into memory. For Bird, that night was more than a fight, it was a scar. It wasn't simply about being challenged physically, it was about pride colliding head-on with another giant of the game. The Celtics won the contest, but Bird never forgot the moment when their rivalry crossed into raw hostility. Fans still talk about it, replaying the grainy footage that captured two titans pushed past their limits. Over time, the heat of that incident cooled into respect. Bird acknowledged Dr. J's greatness, and Irving, in later interviews, spoke fondly of the battles with Boston. But for Bird, the feelings never completely softened. He carried grudges, and that night in 1984 remained a reminder that even legends could be drawn into chaos. The rivalry with Julius Erving gave Larry Bird some of his most memorable victories and most bitter memories. It symbolized the Eastern Conference of the early 80s, grueling, dramatic, and unforgiving. And while Bird admired Dr. J's artistry, he could never quite erase the sting of those clashes, especially the night their tempers flared under the bright lights of the Garden. For Larry Bird, Julius Erving was not just another opponent. He was the rival who tested both his game and his pride, leaving behind moments that could never truly be forgotten or forgiven. Larry Bird's career is remembered for championships, MVP trophies, and countless moments of brilliance. But just as important are the rivalries that defined him. Magic Johnson, the charismatic leader of the Lakers, forced Bird to rise higher under the brightest lights. Isaiah Thomas, the cunning general of the Pistons, reminded him that one stolen pass could change history. Bill Laimbeer, the face of Detroit's rugged style, tested Bird's patience and toughness night after night. Dominique Wilkins, with his soaring athleticism, pushed Bird into one of the greatest duels the league has ever seen. And Julius Erving, elegant yet fierce, turned their battles into unforgettable drama. Together, these rivals carved scars and left memories that Bird never truly let go. They were the obstacles in his path, the sources of frustration and pride, the figures who sharpened his edge and deepened his legacy. Without them, Larry Bird's story would still be great, but with them, it became timeless. Each clash was a reminder that greatness is not achieved in isolation. It is forged in the heat of rivalry, against opponents who refuse to yield. Even after the cheers faded and the banners settled into history, Bird's long memory kept those names alive. He could never quite forgive the pain they caused, and in truth, he never wanted to. Those grudges fueled him, made him tougher, and gave fans the unforgettable drama that defined an era. And so, we look back and ask, which of these rivals truly left the deepest mark on Larry Bird? Was it Magic under the finals lights, Isaiah with his sly brilliance, or perhaps Dominique in that legendary duel? Share your thoughts below, and if you love reliving these golden battles of NBA history, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story from basketball's greatest era.